Hi, I am Maria Sasha Kahn, mentor for Youth Arts in Action and professional dancer with the Bayerische Staatsballett or Bavarian State Ballet.
And I'm Nadia Kahn. I'm also a mentor for Youth Arts in Action, as well as a dancer with the Bayerische Staatsballett 2, which is the Bavarian State Ballet 2.
Today we are here with a very inspiring artist. It is the general music director of the Bavarian State Opera, and this is Mr. Kent Nagano. He's also a fellow American. He's an internationally renowned conductor, and among numerous other awards, has been awarded 3 Grammys, as well as honored with the distinction of the Order of the Rising Sun from Japan. On behalf of Youth Arts in Action, thank you very much for being with us here today.
It's nice to be here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, why did you want to become a conductor? What drew you to that?
Every conductor has their own story of how they became a conductor. In my case, it's something that almost happened by accident. I was preparing to become a composer and also studied the piano very seriously. But for a number of reasons, you never know really why, I just simply ended up being asked by friends and by colleagues to start conducting. Perhaps it was because not anybody else that they could find would be willing to conduct contemporary music, but I, being a composer, would be willing to do that. And then after a while, after 2 or 3 years, it suddenly became apparent that I was conducting all of the time.
Okay.
And then I became a conductor.
Okay, so more by default than not default perhaps, but sort of how life played out.
It's just sometimes things evolve in a way that you don't expect.
Yeah, that's true.
So how would you train for that exactly, or you didn't really, it just kind of came?
Well, the training ended up to be a very old-fashioned and thorough classic training. I started as a pianist and then studied composition. And then after that, my first employment was with an opera company, just beginning as an assistant, as a pianist, as an assistant for the general production, then assistant to the conductor, and then assistant to the chorus. And gradually, over many years, I grew up in the opera house until one day I began conducting opera. And if you look back in the early part of the 20th century and all through the 19th century, this was sort of a classic way to prepare to become a conductor. So many years later, when I received my own chance to have an orchestra, it seemed, looking backwards, that once again, without really having a strategy, I had the classic formation of becoming a conductor.
So perhaps it was your destiny.
Well, some people have suggested that.
Yeah. Who would you say has been your most important teacher and or mentor within your life and career?
It's a good question because I think most successful artists can point to not one, but a number of very, very influential and important professors. And those professors tend to come at a time when you really are ready to make a big leap forward. And without the help of a mentorship, an individual alone can't really make the full potential leap forward. So in my case, there are several people whom I can point to, but probably the key person was my teacher when I was very, very young. I was still a boy, and he became my piano teacher and later my orchestra director. And as a boy, I was a member of the church children's choir as well, and he was also our conductor there. And the reason I mention him, his name was Professor Corey Shelley, is that I grew up on the California coastline, far away from Los Angeles, far away from San Francisco. Those are the two main cities of California. And in in my village there was absolutely nothing, just cows and horses and lots of fish.
That sounds familiar.
And that was really, it's been called being in the middle of nowhere. It's not to say that being in the middle of nowhere isn't advantageous. Beautiful landscapes, the beautiful Pacific Ocean, forests, mountains, and in that context you learn really the basis of drama, the basis of literature, the basis of theatre, because nature is the most dramatic and the most theatrical of all. But on the other hand, it's not a very good place to have access to the roots of traditional European art forms. Mr. Korishele came from Munich, and before that his family was in Tbilisi, Georgia, and therefore he grew up under the Soviet Moscow conservatory tradition. Then as a boy had to escape for political reasons, Georgia, and came to Munich, and that's where he really developed his skills at the Hochschule here, absorbed the great concert tradition of Munich, and then unfortunately again, because of political reasons during the Hitler rise of the Second World War, he was forced to flee to come to America, and by chance his first employment opportunity was teaching children in my little small town in California. So what that meant for me and for many others is that we had a very thorough education of music at an early age, very rigid and strict discipline education, not simply of music, but music in the great Russian and German tradition. I think having that as a foundation at a very early age, because I began working with Mr. Korishele when I was just 6, 7 years old.
That's wonderful.
He gave me the gifts and the foundation so that later on, when I wanted to pursue music in a much more active, full-time way, he gave the basis of really a European aesthetic. For me anyway, without that basis, I think it would have been impossible. California in those days was so far removed from European aesthetics. It was already at the time in the 1960s when students were beginning to rebel, the hippie movement was taking place, Hollywood was finding a very strong presence, popular culture was going wild. And so during my childhood, during the 1960s, these would have normally been the influences. But because of my rather strict upbringing by Professor Korishele, somehow, yes, I was aware of these popular culture trends, but my main routing, my main, I would say, base of education was in the studio of Mr. Korishele.
Does he still have contact with you? He must be very proud to.
Well, we stay very close friends, and we oftentimes laugh because now I'm in Munich, and that's the city that he adopted as his own home. So yes, we look at the irony of the situation, and I think it's amazing to come from a rural area of fishermen and cattle ranchers, horsemen, and to end up here in the city of Munich, where he came from.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
What role do you think the arts play in our society or the society of the world?
The arts is a universal language, as we know, but unfortunately these days sometimes we tend to forget. It's the primary form of communication that we have between us. Without communication, there's no real substance for life. We just simply become a rather superficial or just a surface kind of a society. Profound communication means a sharing of values, a sharing of beliefs, an intense sharing of aesthetics. And these form the building blocks of a culture. And if you can't communicate these with each other in a meaningful way, then it would be fair to say that a culture is in decline, or is in the face of radical transformation. At least that's according to sociological thought or anthropological thought. So if you look back in history, the great museums, the great opera houses, the great symphonic halls in the European capitals, and actually also in the United States of America, they're all built in the very center of the city. Think of Carnegie Hall, or Boston Symphony Hall, or there used to be an opera in Boston, which was unfortunately destroyed, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and of course the European capitals, London, Paris, Vienna, Munich, Berlin. All of these great institutions are focused right in the center because it is the center of the society. It's a meeting place where, traditionally speaking, societies come together and shared, communicated, and discussed, as I said, these values and these beliefs. The opera house was far removed from simply an entertainment form. Yes, of course, ballet, opera, they can be entertaining, but they're much more than that. They're arenas where audiences and the stage come together to share these very, very profound discussions. The danger is if the arts purely become entertainment, and they cease to really become an integral part of a societal intercommunication, then that danger of irrelevance or superficiality or distancing within the society itself comes into play, making it very, very fragile, very unstable, very uncertain whether that's the kind of place that you would like the next generation to grow up in. And these are essential questions to ask, particularly right now. It's fair to ask them. We're in the middle of an economic depression right now. It's very, very serious, and so yes, it's fair to ask, once again, what is the role of the arts? But you can ask these questions, but somehow we see throughout the entire history of mankind that the arts are needed. We've seen that man has never been content to simply define ourselves by facts, numbers, figures. I mean, even though today that seems to be the trend, even in education, let's look at the numbers, let's look at the facts, let's look at the budgets, let's look at the bottom line. But all throughout history, we've seen these moments come, and each time we see that somehow humankind has said no, there has to be something more than just objectivity. We have to be able to dream. We have to be able to have the courage to think of something more. Courageousness, imagination, creativity, leadership, all of these ideas come from the fact that mankind can think beyond the limits of just what objective facts and figures give. The great heroes of the world were able to think far beyond what everyone else said was impossible.
Yeah.
That means that that capacity to think beyond the limits, that's really what art gives us. And whether or not we discuss it or analyze it, we see that actually, as long as humankind exists, there's going to be this need to think beyond. And that's what the arts provide.